Welcome. I am Roberto Alvarez. I am the Executive Director of the GFCC. We're here now for the GFCC Global Innovation Summit, our 2021 edition. This is the fourth and final segment of our summit. If this is your first time here, I want to tell you a bit about the GFCC. The GFCC is a global membership, multi-stakeholder organization. We have members that are corporations, government agencies, private sector councils and industry bodies, and finally, universities. Combining those four segments and fellows, we have a footprint in 30 countries today. The summit was initiated yesterday, and the whole conversations that we're having are around how we can weave 5 future-defining topics into future competitiveness strategies: innovation, sustainability, resilience, inclusiveness, and partnership. Yesterday, we launched 2 GFCC products that we want to invite you to download, to check, to share with your colleagues, and to see how those could be applied to help you better shape competitiveness strategies going forward. We had an amazing series of conversations this morning. We talked about Africa, future markets in Africa. We talked about global innovation, hotspots with leaders from 3 global research universities: Qatar University, the University of South Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the Okinawa Institute of Technology. And we finalized the day with a conversation about the future, not just the future of the GFCC, but Greece, that will host the GFCC Global Innovation Summit in 2022. We have amazing sessions in our final segment, but before we do that, we have a special announcement. And Deborah, I want to turn to you, maybe for you to introduce our guests here and to tell everybody what we are announcing.
Thank you. And first, Roberto, let me thank you and the GFCC team for a fantastic Global Innovation Summit. We're looking forward to this last session, but it's really been rich and exciting. And so right now, we're just delighted to announce a new member of the GFCC. That is Dr. Luiz Carlos, who's the Secretary of Innovation for the city and state of Porto Alegre in Brazil. And Luiz, welcome to the GFCC. We're really honored that you've joined. I've had the opportunity to be to your fantastic city a number of times. And very excitingly, since this is the 10th anniversary of the Global Innovation Summit, it's kind of a back to the future story having you with us today, because we had, our summit back in December of 2011, the first really big one outside of the US. And your colleague and a great leader in Brazil, Mr. Jorge Gerdau, the head of the Brazilian Competitiveness Movement, and a great CEO, was a co-host with your governor. And so you are an innovation hub and an innovation city on the move. So welcome, and we'd love to have you say just a little bit about Porto Alegre. And of course, we all look forward to coming and visiting and seeing what's going on in action in your city.
Deborah, Roberto, it's a pleasure to be here representing Porto Alegre. And Deborah, some of the seeds that were planted by you, by Gerdau, by everyone else are now flowering in Porto Alegre. And Porto Alegre is now the capital of the southernmost state in Brazil, but it's really one of the capitals of knowledge and innovation now in Brazil. We are living a very special moment of alignment of the whole quadruple helix and really push towards innovation and entrepreneurship. And for this city to be joining now GFCC, that's one of the most important and relevant forums of the world that is really putting people together to discuss economic development, innovation, future trends. It's a major step. We want to be a very relevant and very active partner in the GFCC brotherhood, sisterhood, and we will make sure that we want to receive as soon as possible the GFCC members to our beautiful city and share something of what we have been doing on the homework on the last 10 years. Amazing. Thanks a lot. And let's build together a new path for innovation here in Porto Alegre in the world.
Thank you. And I'll just say, that your city and your state really has the best of Brazil. High tech at the highest level, great companies, as well as universities, but also a deep, rich culture that we will all love when we come to Porto Alegre, including for those of you who love the gaucho culture, the best food probably anywhere in Brazil. And I have
The
to say that
best-
Roberto Alvarez, who I guess, Roberto, everybody in the GFCC knows you're all over the world all the time, but you do hail from Porto Alegre. So another great contribution to competitiveness.
Indeed, indeed. We are quite proud of him.
You're very kind. And one interesting thing is that Luis, who also is a full professor at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, is the chief person for the disaster center at the university, right? And that connects really well with our next session. So Deborah, Luis, thank you so much for being here. And I mentioned that because our upcoming panel is Future Resilience. So let me turn to that and introduce our panelists. Luis, we look forward to meeting you soon in Brazil, somewhere in the globe, in person. So resilience is one of the 5 future-defining topics that we are highlighting in this summit, and we've been highlighting that through the GFCC Frame the Future series. Once again, please do not forget to download, to share with your colleagues, Frame the Future, a report coming out of the GFCC Frame the Future series. And when we launched that report, we included 2 goals related to resilience. One is to create facilities, structures, platforms for organizations, countries, and cities to share data and knowledge on past crises in order to drive institutional learning. The other goal is to redesign supply chains. And those are 2 topics that we will be talking about in the Future Resilience session. We will be moderated by our colleague and friend from New Zealand, who's the Vice President of Research for the University of Auckland. Together with Jean, we'll have William Bonnet, Bill, from Whitecap Investments in the United States. Bill has been a champion and a leader for conservation around the globe. We'll have Jerry Holting, who is the chair and co-founder of Global Futures Group. Jerry also is the president of the board of New York Academy of Sciences and a GFCC Distinguished Fellow. From Kazakhstan, we have Aigerin Kushenbayeva. Aigerin is a colleague we had a chance to work together in 2019 when we had the GFCC Global Innovation Summit in Nur Sultan or Astana. Great to have you here, Aigerin. And finally, Kazuyushi Shimada, a director for Japan Science and Technology. He oversees engagement with the Americas, and he will join us from Washington, D.C. Kazu, thank you so much for being here. Your tremendous leadership and partnership in driving our joint work. We have a short vignette before we start a panel. So, future competitiveness, over to you, Jean. Thank you so much for leading this conversation.
Well, thank you, Roberto, and thank you to the GFCC for organising this session on future resilience. The UN General Assembly have defined resilience as the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through the preservation and restoration of its essential basic structures and functions through risk management. That's a brief version of that quite lengthy definition. What is evident in that definition is the challenge of scale. Its resilience extends from individual ask, can people hear me at the moment?
We're getting an echo, Jim.
Yeah.
Someone's got a second channel open. It may be the program channel's got to be shut down.
Yeah.
Rubens.
Yes, we are just checking it.
Okay, is that better? Okay, my apologies for that. I'll get past the technical difficulties. What's evident in that UN definition is the challenge of scale, in that resilience extends from the individual through societies and into systems, including infrastructure, both physical and digital, through economies, and indeed into our wider geopolitical environment. In New Zealand, for example, we're confronting the challenges of the rising social unrest. Auckland has just emerged from a 107-day lockdown as of this morning. But we're also a trading nation based at the bottom of the world, where global supply chains, and in particular our position in global supply chains, makes us extremely vulnerable and is very challenging for a trading nation at the moment. So while we've seen quite rapid recovery, at least initially, of economies, it's not clear that cities have recovered in the same way as yet, and certainly Auckland has not. And the longer term recovery pathway, I think, is far from clear cut, because post-COVID, we will certainly be dealing with the resilience challenges of adapting to climate. So today's speakers, and we have a fantastic panel, and I thank them for contributing to this. Today's panel bring a broad range of unique skills and experience to the many dimensions of that challenge. With very different local and global perspectives on this, and a range of experience well beyond the immediate response to the pandemic. So we will begin by asking our four speakers for brief comments with their perspectives on the issues, and then we'll move into a discussion session, and including responses to your questions, which you can post on the platform for the meeting. So we look forward to your questions. Please post them, and we will attempt to respond to them. We look forward to a lively discussion. And I'd now like to hand over to our first speaker of the session. Bill has been introduced, Bill Bonnet has been introduced by Roberto. He's head of Whitecap Investments, and has a very distinguished record in particularly in environmental applications of technology, and is very prominent also in your contributions to the GFCC. Bill, please.
Excuse me, Mr. William, you.
I apologize. Thank you, Jim. I'm privileged to be here. Let me focus first on, through my work on the Smithsonian, I've become quite involved in coastal wetlands, so-called blue carbon. So we face a global challenge of how to preserve and enhance our immensely valuable but constantly under threat coastal wetlands, which are a huge and important carbon sink in the fight against climate change. That is it's a long-term battle. I don't know that it's received the attention. It's certainly only part of the answer, but the more we can preserve and enhance our wetlands, and prevent both human and natural encroachment and degradation, the more carbon we will store. They are along with peat, they are among the most effective carbon sinks we have on the planet. So I think most of you would be familiar with that concept, but it's important to emphasize it here. You know, we have in the States the restoration of one of our biggest wetlands, the Everglades, in South America, the Pantanal, and in Europe, the Camargue. Those are all important efforts. The living shorelines movement in the Netherlands and Delaware Bay and elsewhere is also important, where we can affect the built environment to provide less bulkheads and more natural shorelines, the better. So that is one part of how I view resilience in terms of the built environment and the natural area resilience. On to cities. In my particular interest, it would be in urban heat islands and the resiliency that we can promote in urban areas if we make a concerted effort in increasing tree cover in underserved minority and globally in many areas of all of our cities. To increase tree cover is to increase resilience. It's to increase quality of life. It's to provide economic and non-economic benefits. It's a resilience tool, which again, I think does not receive the attention that it should. And I think mentioning it here would it helps to promote that. There is a particular technique which is much more prevalent outside the States than inside, and that is so-called Milwaukee Forests, which is a technique now that's been it's been in existence for over 20 years, and it's a mix of species planted on small plots, used now in I think it's over 1,500 to date. Japan, Mumbai has over 200,000 trees planted. Pakistan has 126 Milwaukee forests. So again, I think an underappreciated and under-realized way of quickly greening degraded spaces, and that can be an important tool in increasing resilience and increasing quality of life in urban areas. So we have examples of needed resilience efforts in cities, in natural areas, and in the built environment. It's worth mentioning that the less we do now, the more we put off, the more expensive these efforts will need to be as the climate warms inexorably. New York, I think, is facing the quite severe challenge that they are aware of, but finding very hard to surmount, and that is widespread flooding in their lower lying areas post Sandy. And that's now a disaster of 10 years ago, and there's been frankly very little done in the ensuing 10 years. So the difficulties it's easy to recognize the need for resilience, much more difficult to affect in a meaningful way how we tackle the problem. It's expensive, it's complicated, it's just going to get more so. So it's the alarm bells are beginning to get pretty loud, and I think all of us here on this panel recognize that, and our job is to continue to raise the issues and do what we can to facilitate and promote the kind of resilience that I've talked about. So happy to be here, happy to participate. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Bill. No doubt there'll be many questions because that's the the longer term slow burn crisis, which we're going to be facing for some time, that will test our resilience. I'd like to go now on to our second speaker, Ijerim Kashimbayeva, from Kazakhstan. She is a senior associate at the Center for Research and Consulting, a think tank which specializes in public policy research, strategy development for business and government, and has been very critically involved in the SME development concept for Kazakhstan in terms of regional development. So Ijerim, please.
Yes, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Bill, for your introduction. Moving on from the city's perspective that Bill touched upon, I want to scale it up a little into the collective resilience, especially in terms of institutional context. We have seen through the pandemic that it is important in terms of country level, national level, not to grow as fast, but rather not to fall too much during the crisis. And from institutional economics perspective, an important tool for resilience is informal institutions, which is the links in society that are invisible or non-documented in terms of beliefs, norms, values. And I would like to touch upon this topic more today. Especially it is relevant for Kazakhstan's perspective because in a developing nation like Kazakhstan, strong family bonds, especially in terms of a wider family, it's not like your primary relatives, but even going to hundreds of people is important instrument in terms of income resilience during the crisis like the pandemic that we have seen this year and last year. And this has helped much for the families in terms of unemployment, like keeping the bonds with the elderly people and helping the healthcare system to resist the pressure from the pandemic. And I think that's an important perspective to look at. And secondly, from Kazakhstan side, I think important is what Jim has already mentioned for New Zealand. Even though Kazakhstan is in the center of Eurasia, from the first sight, it's actually quite isolated in terms of harsh climate, mountains from China. It's like 4,000 kilometers to China actually to trade, even though it seems like we're at the border with it. And I think this kind of isolation and global value chain shortening has impacted Kazakhstan as well. And we will touch upon alliances, and I think this has become a crucial point for Kazakhstan, not to move in isolation, but focus more on regional alliances in the Central Asia and in the Eurasian Union. And I think that's two topics from my side for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ijerim. We will move on next to Dr. Kazuyoshi Shimada, who is the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Japan Science and Technology Agency, JST, who has a background in terms of bringing science into engagement with stakeholders, strategy making and community building initiatives through JST. So Kazu, please.
Thank you, Jim. I'm very happy to be here, and I'd like to put an initial remark a little bit in an abstract point of view. On the platform of GFCC Frames the Future series this year, we have discussed with GFCC members how we can frame the better future responding the crisis. And it was very nice opportunities for us this year. And my interim summary as a viewpoint of JST is not only make a technological solution, but recognizing ongoing crises are important to increase resilience of our society. And I've learned crisis and disaster are different. Crisis is a status and disaster is an event. We cannot predict disaster, but we can cultivate the resilience to rise above it. And we cannot, in order to rise above disasters and frame a better future, we must recognize the crisis we are facing and have a positive belief and plan to have resilience and sustainability of us. And this is a basic principle to frame the better future responding to the crisis, and we might call this build back better as well. So yeah, at first, this is my initial remark, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you further. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazu. Which brings us to our final introductory speaker, the Honourable Jerry Holton, who is chair and co-founder of the Global Futures Group and has an enormous and extensive record in terms of the rebuilding and greening and the making of cities more livable, which I think is an ambition we certainly all share, and a major challenge, I think, across the globe. Jerry.
Thank you, Jim. And pleasure to be here. And to all the other panelists, I'd love to build on your remarks. So let me first talk some about cities, because I do spend a lot of time with working with cities around the world. I think in addition, and sort of building on the ideas of trees that Bill talked about, is this whole movement towards, I would say, an improved quality of life in cities, which at first doesn't sound like a resilience solution, sounds like a life is better solution. But if you think about what a well-designed city provides, it actually turns into resilience. So let's say you take Paris's model of a 15-minute city. Well, it's more bikeable, it's more walkable. All those are things which in the middle of a problem are still accessible ways of mobility. And if you have access to resources inside that 15-minute zone, it means you've got a chance of keeping food on the table, of continuing your life as much as possible. So I think that thinking about how to allow people to have less wasted time, maybe less commuting, to have access to resources close by, education, daycare, is a piece of building a resilient city. It also gives you a city you like to live in. So when it's not a crisis, you're feeling good about living in that city. So I think that picture is one that we can keep of sort of doubling the benefit, quality of life, and also resilient. And secondly, I want to jump to a much more macro level that affects individuals. And this is what I would call the challenge of working with robots or automation. And this is not resilience in the terms of natural disasters or terms of even pandemics. This is resilience in a challenge that automation is posing. And the issue is, where are the jobs that people can do? There are lots of jobs people can't do in a world with robots, but they're different jobs than a lot of people in the world do now. Manual labor should be shifted to robots. Repetitive tasks shifted to robots. That allows people to do much grander things, to enjoy their children, to take care of their parents, to explore new opportunities. So I'm in favor of becoming more resilient again in the face of automation, positively resilient. And for me, this ultimately ends up being a question of education. That is, the skills and the education we give people is the way they can stay even with robots. I often like to say the goal of the future ought to be keeping people smarter than robots. Well, the current education system, I think, fails enormously. If I look at, I pick India, with an enormous number of young people, the education system educates a thin layer of the top students and leaves the rest stranded. What are they going to do? Up against robots, they're going to fail. That's not a good outcome. If I could say the same thing about the United States, our basically K-12 system produces about half of its students who could not compete against a robot or automation. So we leave them as we automate truck driving, no more truck drivers. What do they do? So I'm a big advocate of education needs to step up to the game and produce skills for everybody, not skills for the brightest, skills for everybody. Finally, I have one other place I'd like to talk about because it excites me so much, which is as chair of the Academy of Sciences, I'm part of a team which is creating an international science reserve. And this is, think of it this way, it's the same way that we have military reserve. They get ready, they train, they understand the problem, they know how to get into action. Well, the same idea would be with scientists, to have supercomputing and scientists already trained to respond to the next pandemic or to respond to a waterborne pathogen in a water system in a big city, or respond to a solar flare that takes out a lot of electrical capacity. Well, we could predict a set of these things and get ready. And our goal is to do that. We're working with IBM and Google and others to create this science reserve. And I'm looking forward to, with Kazu, teaming up with Japan on this. So we have a chance to create a resilient force ready to step in and say, we got a problem, we just had a catastrophe, we're ready to go. Just like a fire department or a military reserve would do the same thing. So those are my three things. Cities, I think we all agree, really important. Future of work, and I want to compliment Singapore and Malaysia on really stepping up and thinking about this ahead of time and getting their education system ready to solve these problems. And third is, I'm excited about International Science Reserve. We've got a year's worth of work to make it, figure out how to do it, but we'll see it roll out in the future. I want to give you a heads up, it's coming. Thank you, Jim.
Okay. Thanks, Jerry. You talked a bit about the future of work, which I think is, and resilience of work and adaptability, I guess, of workforce. But to go back, Ijam, we have a question on the chat from Chad Evans. The larger perspective on resilience, can she share any practices from Kazakhstan or elsewhere on how to bolster, for example, income resilience during economic downturns?
Yes, thank you, Chad, for a great question. I'm going back to the talk on informal institutions, and I think one of the examples during the pandemic that we have seen is how wider family has helped their relatives during the downturn. For example, those living in the rural areas, this is in Kazakhstan, like 40 people of population or 40% of population. And we have seen how relatives who deal in agriculture, they has helped their relatives in the cities in terms of sustenance, in terms of cutting costs for food, and the basic things. This was one example. Also, as we have strong family bonds between young people and old people and their parents, there was a high level of unemployment in the cities, especially in the service sector, as we have seen, I think, in most of the places worldwide. The youth in Kazakhstan, they could turn back to their rural areas, to their parent houses, and stay there during the pandemic. which like again saved lots of costs and allowed them not to fall too much in terms of their income and sustain for a year or so. And another example is when family members care. That's like we have this hierarchy in the society, and we care for elderly people. This, in terms of Kazakhstan, was helpful because when healthcare system failed, collective effort of the relatives allowed to move some costs to the private hands, and this helped much in keeping elderly people in the society. There is an interesting example that in Kazakhstan, old people are also integrated in terms of babysitting and looking after the children, while women can enter the labor force like in traditional societies. And I think these are two examples. And one more I would like to tell is more on what Jerry has pointed out in terms of technology and how we can develop skills. There was one fun example when because we are allowed to work remotely now, and for foreign companies, and especially in IT sector, there was a case of 200 people in the village, in the rural area, working remotely in terms of coding, like basic things, for a person sitting in a city, and he was the integrator. And I think this was a great example of how a person who speaks a language, how in general people who speak languages and can connect to the wider world could connect some rural areas in the country to gain some skills and to increase their income and knowledge base.
Thank you, Jerome. That highlights a couple of things, I guess. One is the importance of digital platforms. If you're going to work in that way, that you need the resilience of the digital platforms which will enable that way of working. And if I could go back to your comment, Jerry, earlier about countries who you think are doing well in terms of future of work and resilience of future workforce, of Singapore and Malaysia, what are they doing differently that builds that more resilient workforce?
Thank you, Jim. And I like Aldrum's example of 200 workers in a rural area doing this. This is exactly what leads to more resilience in a country and a society, is to spread out this opportunity. We actually face that same issue in America. We've got many rural areas that need to be plugged in and do what you described. So the one thing that I think is interesting, and Jim, you're going to have to ask that question again because I got so wound up with the rural idea. So just remind me briefly.
I was just saying, you pulled out the examples of Singapore and Malaysia in terms of a more resilient and future-ready workforce. What are they doing differently? And what are the lessons?
So I think here's what I've seen. First, both countries use foresight to look into the future and ask, where is the world headed? And they sample information from around the world to do that. And they then identify what they think those trends are. And of course, one of the big ones is this automation and the change in work. And then they say, well, what could we do to get ready? And they, in their case, both look to the education system. In the meantime, they actually wrote an industrial 4.0 agenda so that they could spread across the country a picture of, well, what do we need to do? What should we do? How do we get engaged? And then they began to really work with special institutions, especially education, in saying, well, what are you doing to train our people to be able to work with automated machines, to work with robots, to work with an IT system that's, programming. And I think they've both done a good job of anticipating and then preparing. And it's not to say that others aren't also, because I was in Kazakhstan, I met a construction firm a big construction firm that has 25 processes already digitized, from the buying of the land all the ways to the painting of the apartment. And it's better than anything in the United States. So they've clearly been teaching their engineers and their workers how to work with digital technology. So there's some great examples of anticipate and then use these new tools, and then prepare your society primarily through education opportunity. That's what I've seen.
Kazu and Bill, I wonder if you had any further comments. Kazu, particularly in terms of workforce flexibility in response to a disaster, for example, where certain industry sectors are impacted. What experience can we draw upon in that area?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yes, as Jerry mentioned, education is very important, but our president, Dr. Hamaguchi, always emphasized the importance of preparedness. And preparedness is not only as stockpiling of food or oil, but training daily, thinking about the role in society and building trust with others by helping each other, and so on, as Adrian told about. The ties among the people in society is also a kind of preparedness of our society. And also, Bill mentioned minding the environment, natural environment, is also very important in order to consider about the sustainability of our future. And this is also making awareness and talk together and think together and acting together. It takes a huge amount of time. And even though engaging the AI or information technologies, it is also taking time. So we need to consider about the situation we are facing. It's a very slowly, it proceeds very slowly, but we can consider about the speed and the preparedness in our society. And yeah, recovering from the disaster in Japan, we are aware of the order of the importance is self-help, mutual help, and public help. So without the strength of individuals, we cannot cope with disasters. And in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, each individual needs to protect himself or herself. But on the other hand, society that fosters trust and helps each other will be better able to emerge from the recovery process. And the role of the government is also significant, so it will take time. So it will take time. So there is a kind of time frame, different time frame, in order to make a preparedness of our society. But I also agree and have a sympathy of the points of Adrian in Kazakhstan. Thank you.
Bill, did you want to chip in on this area? You're still muted, I think, Bill.
I endorse what Kazu just said. These are long time frames. I think the latest I read is 550 million people in coastal areas will in fact be underwater by 2050. That's not a lot of years away. I don't think we have sufficient appreciation of the urgency to begin much more active investment in coastal resiliency in our urban areas that are at risk. These are long tail, to build on Kazu's point, these are long tail projects. I don't quite get, and I need help understanding, and I want to learn more about green bonds, because I don't hear a lot of what should be taking place, and that is the kind of investment that we're just beginning to talk about in the States, that will be needed to build in resilience, that will certainly in Miami Beach, in Mumbai, in Shanghai, in New York City, that we will need to make those investments within the next 10 years to effectively protect those populations from rising sea levels and storms. So it is not too early to do a much better job of the long tail planning that Kazu talked about.
So, Bill, if you talked about the percentage of kind of economic activity, if you like, industry that's situated within that sea level rise belt, I mean, you're talking about a huge transition here, really, that would be affected by that, because many of our cities are built very close to water and very close to coast.
Well, I think the more nuanced view is not, the alarmist view would be everything's at risk. Not everything is at risk, but significant assets are at risk. And significant parts of certain cities are at risk. And I think that simply the point I'm trying to make is you need a much more robust planning process for the most vulnerable assets that are important to the resilience of certain cities. And if sea level rise proceeds even faster than it appears to be proceeding, then we have a whole nother level of problem. It's too early to say that, but it's a possibility now that I think we should begin talking seriously about, because that would impact virtually all of coastal assets. We don't think we're there yet. I'm not a scientist, but we're not quite at the alarmist stage on sea level rise, but we need to watch it.
Hey, Jim, I'd add to pass on to Bill that one of the team at Global Futures Group is working on debt swaps for climate adaptation, especially in the developing world. And we're also going to talk to the reinsurance industry, because if they did good adaptation, you should get a more insurable situation, bring down rates. So add that to green bonds. So
Great. Thank you. That's very valuable. Appreciate that, Jerry.
Hi, Jerome. Your comments on resilience and extended families, cultural closeness have prompted a number of responses, and Chad has come back again in terms of how do we fortify that, because I think of our experience, for example, in New Zealand of hard lockdowns, where we went into bubbles of just the people living in your immediate environment. So in fact, we almost took the reverse things of reducing people's connectivity through that time, whereas the examples that you're calling upon actually call for a much broader societal resilience, I think, than we observed. But I guess Chad's question there is how do you scale that? How do you scale that kind of cultural, or is it lost in some cultures and still strong in some cultures?
Yeah, thank you, Chad, once again. I think the thing with this cultural ties and closeness works for societies like the one we are in Kazakhstan, traditional ones in a developing country. And those ties have been developing for decades, for years. And this is what kept it so helpful during the pandemic, which was like 1 and 2 years. And in terms of multicultural societies, I don't think I have good answer for this, because in Kazakhstan there was a negative kind of side of it, is because these ties have been held together because people have not followed the rules of lockdown, and because there was large informal sector in terms of shadow economy, and people have continued to interact not online but offline. So that might be the negative side of it. So I think it's in terms of the healthcare and the pandemic side of it, the multicultural societies and what you have mentioned in New Zealand is a better way of coping with such crisis.
Thank you. Another question for you, Bill. Examples from Mark Dresian. Do you have examples of cities that are preparing for these kind of changes? Who's doing well that you see in this area? Bill, you need to unmute.
Apologize. Well, the Netherlands have been at this for 300 years, so I'd sure like to see Dutch SWAT teams going around the world using their expertise on resiliency. So that's sort of a flippant answer, but it's an important one. It's the mobilization of public recognition of the problem and then effective mobilization of public resources. Frankly, I think our friends in China, I hesitate to bet against China when it comes to making necessary investments. I don't think Shanghai will in fact go underwater. So mobilization of resources becomes an important part of the equation, and effectiveness of political systems becomes important. So the cities that are planning but then effectuating are the cities that are going to do the best. It's still very early days. I would respond by saying it's very early days, and the more high level attention can be paid to the next 30 years, what's needed over the next 30 years, the better we will all be in 2050 for sure.
Thanks. I'd like to go back to solar flares, Jerry, because one of the things that has been revealed in this is, our increasing reliance on digital platforms in terms of resilience. If you look at the immediate response to COVID, the companies that were based on digital platforms and could continue to operate, were much advantaged through that. But you raise the possibility of the type of disasters which remove some of those platforms on which we are increasingly dependent.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but the last time the Earth had a major solar storm of significance was apparently 1840, 1850. And we had enough electrical systems then, telegraph and others, that there were fires and systems going down, but that we were barely into the electrical age. Of course, now we're way into the electrical age, and the numbers are astounding. If we had a solar flare that's equal to 1840, I think the damage number clocks out at $1 trillion or a couple $1 trillion across the Earth, and it would be devastating. Now, some of what we do is fiber optics, and fiber optics would be protected from that. But a lot of even fiber optics is powered by electrical systems, creating the laser pulses. So it's one of those. I'm hoping the International Science Reserve we create begins to kind of rank the likelihood and the impact, because some of these are unlikely, but the impacts are high. Others are more likely. The impacts are lower. And come up so the Earth, we all think about a little better. Where are we at risk? Where can we intervene? Some of these maybe we can't intervene. We're just going to have our fingers crossed. But it's the future I see as building, and I'm excited the fact that people are stepping up to do it.
But this feeds into the wider question of kind of economic resilience in a trading world, right, where we are utterly dependent on these platforms for the interaction of nations.
I would just add a point on that. I think as we're seeing China and the US both say they want to create more internal economies, self-sufficient economies, I think one of the risks that the developing world loses a key market because we're a key market for lots of these countries. So I think there's a couple alternatives. One would be we keep a more open view of what we build in China and the US and Europe and use products from around the world. But the second could be that the developing world needs to create better trading consortiums amongst themselves. So that I'm going to take Africa. Africa is a huge market. And if they could trade without tariffs and without customs taxes between countries, they create a very dynamic market, which doesn't depend on the United States. It's their market. And China's done that in some ways. China started using the world as a marketplace, and now in many ways, it's a self-contained market. Its own people consume enough goods to create a great economy. So I would push that picture of the developing world needs to learn to work with its sister and brother countries as a way of resilience in case the US and China begin to cut off using their products.
Kazu, I'm interested in your view on this as well, in Japan's history as a trading nation.
Yeah, I agree. And we are always talking about the future of our industry. And in the past, we exported cars, semiconductors, etc. But we are now, our structure of the industry is now changing. And but even though we are considering about the future of industry, we should not consider only on the industry itself, but the environment that Japan is existing and relationship with other countries. And as our country's population is steeply decreasing at present, and maybe China will follow. And so we need to consider about new industry relating to adapting the new situation. And I have not right answer on that, but in the first day of the Global Innovation Summit, Jim, as a panel, and the keynote speaker, Mr. Jim Clifton, presented the state of mind negative experience index of our world. And in Japan also, we are minding a kind of degradation of the mindset of our society. And if we consider about more positively, we might consider about the new industry coping with the situation of the mental health. And it might be relating to the development of digital society. And such kind of interface is very interested in to consider about the future industry. That's my personal opinion. Yep.
I'm very conscious that the clock is running down on this session and that we're about to reach the end of it. I would just like to thank you all for actually the very wide-ranging and quite future-focused nature of the discussions. It's been very rewarding and very, I think, very invigorating discussion. So thank you very much for your perspectives on that. Thank you all.